The Path is a teaching series sponsored by World Missionary Evangelism. We hope that this series will deepen your knowledge and walk in our Lord Jesus Christ. Here's your host, John Cathcart.
Well, we continue to talk about the parents and the family of Paul. Of course, his parents were living in Tarsus, in Cilicia, 360 miles north of the Holy Land. But they seem to have had a married daughter in Jerusalem whose son, on one memorable occasion, saved Paul's life. Now, though they must have ordinarily used the Septuagint version of the Bible, from which the greater majority of the apostles' quotations are taken, and from which nearly his entire theological phraseology is derived, yet Paul's parents trained him to use Aramaic as his native tongue and to read the scriptures in their own venerable original Hebrew, and that is an accomplishment not possessed by many learned Jewish Hellenists. Now, you must remember this, that the original scriptures were in Hebrew. And when the Jews living in Egypt, in Alexandria, well, of course, they lost the command of their own language, and they spoke Greek, and they wanted to have access to their scriptures, and so they appealed to the high priest in Jerusalem, and the high priest in Jerusalem sent copies of the Hebrew scriptures in Hebrew down to Alexandria, and their scholars, almost 70, that's where we get the name Septuagint from, they translated the Old Testament into Greek. And the Jews read it and agreed it was a good translation. Now, here is where some confusion creeps in. The translators of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek focus primarily on the Torah. So you can think of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They focus mainly on the Torah. It was later that the rest of the scriptures were translated. So in Jesus' own day and time, the scriptures they were reading were not in the Hebrew, which we call the Masoretic, but they were in Greek. They were the Septuagint. And the fact of the matter is that the Septuagint Bible is the Bible that the early church used. They didn't use the Masoretic text. They certainly didn't use the King James, which didn't come along for 1,600 years. They used the Septuagint version of the scriptures. Now, Paul was a Hebraist. You want to call him a Jew, I guess we'll tolerate that. But he was a Hebraist in the fullest sense of the word, and that is clear from almost every word of his epistles. Now, Paul reckons time by the Hebrew calendar, and Paul makes constant references and allusions to Jewish customs, Jewish laws, and Jewish festivals. His metaphors and turns of expression are derived with great frequency from that quiet family life for which Jews in all ages have been distinguished. And though he writes in Greek, it is not by any means in the Greek of the schools. Now, let me explain that. He writes in Greek, but it is not a learned Greek. And incidentally, while I'm making that statement, let me make this statement. The revelation of Jesus Christ to John on the Isle of Patmos is written probably in the worst Greek that has ever been written. And analysts of the text say that whoever wrote it was writing at a ferocious speed. I mean, it's not something thought over. It's proof it came to him. The Lord spoke to him. Well, Paul was not writing in the Greek of the polished Greek schools. Paul was a Hebraist. Now, the famous critic Longinus did praise Paul as a master of the dogmatic style, but a Tarsian professor or philosopher in Athens would have been inclined to ridicule his Hebraic peculiarities, his harshly mingled metaphors, his strange grammatic forms and irregular construction. St. Jerome, criticizing the passage in 2 Corinthians 9, which in our version reads like this: I was not burdensome to you. It appears to mean literally, I did not benumb you. Now, that would get your attention right away. Some of these things are translated for the benefit of us who come along later. But Paul literally says, I did not mean to benumb you. What he means is, I didn't mean to be a burden to you. And the various syllogisms of his style, coming from Cilicia, Tarsus, the syllogisms of his style are spoken of as being numerous. And it is possible that such they were, though that can hardly be detected with certainty by the modern reader. In other words, the translators have taken the rough spots out of what Paul wrote. And so we can't catch the writing of Paul, really get into the writing of Paul, because it's been translated into good English. And though Tarsus was a city of advanced culture, the state in which it was located, the country, Cilicia, was as intellectually barbarous as it was morally despicable. Now, the proper language of Cilicia was a dialect of Phoenician, and the Greek spoken by some of the cities was so faulty, so bad, as to have originated the famous expression which we use, which is solecism, a solecism. And that has been perpetuated in all languages and into modern times. So when we talk about a solecism, we're talking about a hopeless and impossible linguistic and grammatical construction. So that is interesting. The city that Paul came from was not famous for good Greek grammar.
At the heart of everything World Missionary Evangelism does is reaching out and saving the lost through sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. We do this through native missionaries. Right now, we have many native missionaries who need sponsors. That's right, partners just like you, who will help them become full-time workers for Christ. That provides this native missionary with the ability to give his life full-time to gospel outreach. We also need Bibles. That allows us to share the word with those we reach in the mission field. If you would like to either sponsor a native missionary or provide the gift of Bibles, simply call us at 1-800-501-2851.
Well, the residence of a Jew in a foreign city might, of course, tend to undermine his national religion and make him indifferent to his hereditary customs. On the other hand, it might produce a result directly the reverse of this. Now, I have seen in my life in the ministry, I've seen families where one member went astray. And say a mother or a father, they just went astray. And it's interesting, sometimes that will be destructive to family members. But I remember one case where the mother and the family went astray, and the son, who had been somewhat ambivalent and somewhat on the fence, really straightened up and became a solid citizen and a good Christian. So you never know which is going to happen. Now, there had been abundant instances of Hellenistic Jews, Greek Jews, who Hellenized or became like the heathen in matters far more serious than the language which they spoke. But on the other hand, the Jews as a nation have always shown an almost miraculous vitality, and so far from being denationalized by homes among heathen, have simply been confirmed in the intensity of their patriotism and faith. And we know that this had been the case with that important body, the Jews of Tarsus. And in this respect, the Jews of Tarsus differed considerably from the Jews of Alexandria. Now, how do you explain this? You have Jews in two essentially Greek cities, and one of them stay very Jewish and Judaic, and the others become very loosey-goosey. And that was the case with the Jews of Alexandria and the Jews of Tarsus. However, the Jews, regardless, could not have been exempt from that hatred which has through so many years wronged and dishonored their noble race, and which was already virulent among the Romans of that day. Incidentally, AntiSemitism is becoming rampant once again in Europe. It was rampant in the time of Hitler, and it's becoming rampant again. But all that we hear about the Jews in Tarsus and in Cilicia shows that the Cilician Jews were as capable as any of their brethren of repaying hate with double hatred and scorn with double scorn. And they would all the more likely do so from the condition of things around them. And what do I mean by that? Well, the belief in paganism was more deeply rooted in the provinces than in Italy. Now, this is a common phenomenon. I have known of British people. There's a famous story, a book called Sir, S-I-R, Sir. And it's about a man from Jamaica or from the Caribbean, black man from the Caribbean, who went to England and found out he was far more British than the British, more English than the English. He spoke better English. He behaved like a good Englishman used to behave. And this is very, very common. So the belief in paganism was more deeply rooted in the provinces than in Italy, places like Cilicia. And it was especially vigorous in Tarsus. And in this respect, no unfitting place for the burial of Julian the Apostate. Now, no ages are worse, and no places more corrupt than those that draw the iridescent film of an intellectual culture over the deep stagnancy of moral degradation. And that, if we stop and think about it, is exactly what is happening in the United States today. We are drawing this film of intellectual culture over a deep stagnancy of moral degradation. We need to be careful. Well, this was the condition of Taurus. It was the seat of a celebrated school of letters. It was at the same time the capital of a province so low in universal estimation that it was counted among the three most villainous Ks of antiquity. And the three most villainous Ks of antiquity were Cappadocia, Cilicia, and Crete. Well, what religion there was at this period had chiefly assumed an orgiastic and oriental culture. And the popular faith of many, even in Rome, had become a strange mixture of Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Phrygian, Phoenician, and Jewish elements. And by the way, we have a lot of this in church work today, a peculiar mixture of ideas. I knew of when I was in industry, of a fine woman, she was a secretary, who emphatically stated that all people, in her opinion, all people are basically good. That is the dead opposite of what the Bible says and what Christians are supposed to believe. But we get these elements, these crazy elements from different sources, all mixed up in the faith. And we're seeing this with some of our politicians today who are saying, I forget, was it Chelsea Clinton who said that she thought it was absolutely un-Christian to deny or to oppose abortion. So people get crazy, wild ideas. And the wild, fanatical enthusiasms of the Eastern cults, shook with new sensations of mad sensuality and weird superstition and feeble and jaded despair of Aryan paganism. Well, this was the spiritual condition of Tarsus, and I think by this point you should have gathered the idea that Tarsus was a pretty mixed up and messed up society.
Every 6 seconds, in developing nations all over the globe, a child dies for the lack of a few cents worth of food or medicine. As you've been listening to me, 3 children have already died. Children who have so much potential dying a horrible death due to hunger. The change in your purse or your pocket could probably feed that child for a day or more, and yet that clock keeps ticking and children keep dying. For almost 6 decades, World Missionary Evangelism has been pulling children from the brink of death back to life. And we've been doing it through programs like Food for Hunger. Today, you can be a part of that. Today, you can save a life. Today, you can build a bridge from hopelessness to hope and fully show the compassion that you have in your heart. Why don't you make an impact and save one right now by simply picking up the telephone and calling us toll-free at 1-800-501-2851. It's 1-800-501-2851. The clock is ticking on another life. Won't you stop the death of one child?
Well, in the last section, we described the paganism and the spiritual condition, moral condition, cultural condition of Tarsus. And the Tarsus paganism, the paganism of Tarsus, was composed of all these mixed multinational elements. Well, there, in Plutarch's time, a generation after Paul, the sword of Apollo, miraculously preserved from rust and decay, was still on display. And Hermes Arionis, or the luck bringer, still appears purse in hand on their coins. and Iescopulus was still believed to manifest his power and presence in the neighboring Aegean. But the traditional founder of the city of Tarsus was the Assyrian Sardanapalus, whose semi-historical existence was still confused in the then syncretism of pagan worship with various representatives of the sun god, the Asiatic Sandan, the Phoenician Baal, and the Grecian Hercules. And we shouldn't get too critical, because we sure have mixed up a lot of stuff in Christianity and gotten away from our roots. Well, the gross elusiveness and origin of this worship and its connection with the very types and ideals of luxurious effeminacy, unbounded gluttony, and brutal license were quite sufficient to awake the indignant loathing of each true-hearted Jew. And these revolts of natural antipathy in the hearts of a people in whom true religion has ever been united with personal purity, this would be intensified with patriotic disgust when they saw that at the main festival of this degraded cult, effeminate Sardanapalus and the equally masculine Semiramis was a woman. So you have this effeminate man and this masculine woman, each equally detestable, were worshipped with rites which externally resembled the pure and thankful rejoicing of the Feast of Tabernacles. And this had to be appalling to the Jews, that this pagan festival of these depraved people resembled the Feast of Pentecost. And Paul must have witnessed this festival. He had to. He grew up there. He must have seen at Antioch the most defiant symbol of contentment, cynical contentment, with all which is animal in the statue of Sardanapalus, which is represented as snapping his fingers while he uttered the sentiment engraved on the pedestal. And the sentiment is eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. The rest is nothing. Now think about that. Think about that. Here is this pagan entity, depraved being, and on his pedestal is inscribed the words, eat, drink, enjoy yourself, the rest is nothing. Now think of what Paul said. If in this life only we have hope, let's eat and drink and enjoy ourselves, because tomorrow we die. I have no doubt that Paul had this engraving on the statue in mind when he made that statement. Well, the results which such pagan spectacles and which such sentiments had left on Paul's mind had not been one of tolerance or a blunted sensibility to the horror of evil. These sights and sounds and practices had inspired, on the one hand, an overpowering sense of disgust, and on the other hand, an overwhelming conviction, deepened by subsequent observation, that mental perversity leads to and is in turn aggravated by moral degradation. Let me tell you something. Read it, do it. Pornography, reading it, viewing it, watching it, listening to it, it will do its work. And the resultant condition will follow. That error in the intellect involves an ultimate error in the life and in the will. And that the darkening of the understanding is inevitably associated with the darkening of the soul and the spirit, and that out of such darkness spring the hidden things which degrade immoral lives. Now, I've had some relatives make some remarks that just displayed entire ignorance One of them said about our missionary activity, are you going to go over and kind of basically mess up with your religion their happy pagan lives? Let me tell you something. Ain't very few people happy in Kenya. And if you want to see what pagan life is, you ought to go to places where paganism is before you make stupid comments. And so he who would know what paganism looked like, to one who had seen it, namely Paul from his childhood upwards, in its characteristic developments, you need to read that most terrible passage of all Scripture, in which the full blaze of scorching sunlight burns with its fiercest flame of indignation on the pollutions of pagan wickedness. And what I am referring to is what Paul wrote. Boy, this messes up people today. In Canada, this is hate speech. But if you read Romans chapter 1, you get Paul's assessment of how moral degradation progresses and where it leads to. And it doesn't lead to happiness, it leads to disaster. Because Paul says, because of these things, God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts to dishonor their own body between themselves. And for this cause, God gave them up to vile affection.
55 years. It's a long time. But that's how long World Missionary Evangelism has been taking care of children. It started with just a few little orphans in India, and it's grown to touch thousands over the last 5 decades. But what does child sponsorship mean? Well, child sponsorship means that someone just like you is providing food, clothing, medical care, an education, and in many cases, a home in which to live for children who have no one to turn to. Yet through child sponsorship, there's a bridge built, a bridge from nightmares to dreams, an opportunity for those dreams to be realized through education, an opportunity for that child who had no future now to be blessed with a future that lifts others up as you lifted him up. Why don't you pray about and think about sponsoring a child today?